Welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. We have a fascinating section of Luke 17 to look at this week. It's the relatively well-known story when Jesus healed 10 men who had a skin disease. Now, typically we say this is Jesus healing the 10 lepers, so this is a major concern that we need to address, and that is whether these men actually had what we think of as leprosy, technically Hansen's disease, or whether the Hebrew behind that and the Greek behind those words would be better translated in a more general sort of way. So that's going to be one of our major questions to answer. Also, we need to ask, what's the history of Samaria and what's its connection with the people of Judea? So we need to talk about Samaria and Samaritans and how they figure into the Gospels as well as the history of the early church. Along the way, we're going to take a trip back into Leviticus 13 and 14 to talk about skin disease, and we're going to also take a look at an archaeological find from the temple in Jerusalem that connects with one of the words that Jesus uses to describe the Samaritan. So a lot of good stuff to get to. Let's jump in with these first few verses of Luke 17:11 and following. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was passing along between Samaria and Galilee. And as he entered a village, he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance and lifted up their voices saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." I have four notes on the screen. The first one is that this is the third travel notice of Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. So you may remember back at the time of the Transfiguration, right after that, Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. So this is the third notice that he's on his way. Notice, too, that there's a theme of separation or borders in this text. So Jesus is between Samaria and Galilee. So Samaria, as you can see from the map, Samaria is below Galilee. And so Galilee's to the north, Samaria is to the south. They're at a border region. And there's also another kind of separation or border between these men with the skin disease and Jesus. So that kind of becomes a implicit theme that's woven into this account. And then thirdly, notice that Samaria is mentioned first. So between Samaria and Galilee, not between Galilee and Samaria. That's because, of course, the importance later in this account of the Samaritan himself. And also, interestingly, I don't think I've noticed this before, but when they cry out, they simply say, "Have mercy on us." They don't say, "Heal us." They don't ask for anything specific except mercy. And of course, Jesus is going to display mercy in his own Jesus sort of way by healing them, by cleansing them. Now here you see another map that shows at least one person's representation of where the journey might have taken Jesus, all the way from the northwestern shore of the Sea of Galilee at Capernaum, all the way down through Samaria, ending there close to Jerusalem. So the one thing I want to point out with regard to the language it's used here is when they say, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." So that's epistates in the Greek. Now the reason this is interesting is, first of all, Luke is the only one in the New Testament to use this designation, and he uses it in reference to Jesus. You can see the places in his gospel on the screen. So chapter 5, a couple times in chapter 8, a couple times in chapter 9, and then in Luke 17, where we are now. Now, in every single one of these, with the exception, the possible exception, the one we're looking at today, it's always the disciples who use this language. And now here, it's this group of 10 men. So in Robert Stein's commentary, he says that this title, epistates, was a favorite of Luke, only used by him in the New Testament, as I just mentioned, whereas the title teacher in Luke was used of Jesus only by strangers. Master, epistates, was used only by Jesus' followers and reveals better his authority and might. Luke avoided using the title rabbi for Jesus, and some scholars speculate that epistates was Luke's designation for rabbi instead of using that word itself. Now, the reason this is interesting is because right away, these 10 men are represented as saying something which is typically found, always found, in other cases, on the lips of the disciples. So are they disciples? Are they going to be disciples? That's kind of the question that is lingering in the air, as it were, when they use this kind of language. Now, let's talk about Samaria. So it's a long history, and if you're interested on my YouTube channel or the 1517 YouTube channel, you can search my name and Samaritans, and I have a longer video that goes through the whole history of the Samaritans. Suffice it to say at this point that the Samaritans themselves, by the time we get to the first century, are extremely close to Jews. So if you go back to the Old Testament, 2 Kings chapter 17, you read that after the deportation of the Israelites in the northern kingdom, that the Assyrians brought in other peoples, and these other peoples were extremely syncretistic. They were trying to worship Yahweh and other gods, and it was kind of a messy situation theologically there for quite a while. But if you skip so that's the 8th century, but skip forward to closer to the time of Jesus, and we have a more accurate portrayal of who the Samaritans are. So we know that around the time of Alexander the Great, they built their own temple to Yahweh. This is important, to Yahweh at Mount Gerizim, which they considered to be sacred. And then later, one of the Maccabean rulers destroyed, John Hyrcanus, he destroyed that temple in Samaria. It never was rebuilt, but the Samaritans continued to worship close to there in a place called Shechem. And we know that sometime anyway before the first century, they had their own copy of the Torah. Now, there were a couple of slight and very interesting changes, tendentious changes in that. But the Samaritan Pentateuch, as their copy of the Torah is called, actually bears some resemblances in a few places to where the New Testament quotes the Old Testament. So it's by no means, as it were, just to be discounted. It's a good copy of the Torah that should be consulted. So all of this to say that when we get to the first century, the Samaritans, were reading the Torah. They believed in the Messiah. We know that from John chapter 4. The woman at the well in Samaria, she is interested in the Messiah, and she says Jesus is a Messiah. So they have a messianic expectation. They're very close to the Jews, but there's still the separation, right? Jesus tells the woman at the well that salvation is from the Jews. So you can think of them as almost Jewish, we might say. They're kind of on that border between Jews, but they have slightly different theologies. But all of this to say that very often it seems to me that Samaritans are portrayed in teaching and preaching as if they are far, far removed from Judaism. They are not. They're not Jews, but they're extremely close. And the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans was not always antagonistic. Jesus wanted to stay at a Samaritan village, right? They didn't accept him, but he expected to receive hospitality there. Jesus went to Samaria and talked with a woman at the well. He's here on the border between the region of Galilee and Samaria. So all of that to say that let's not caricature the Samaritans and portray them to be some kind of just wildly syncretistic faith that all the Jews wanted nothing to do with. No, it was a closer relationship than is sometimes assumed. Okay, now, so that's a little bit about the Samaritans. Let's talk about leprosy now. So it's a bit of a complicated subject, so I'm going to keep it as concise as possible. All right, first of all, the words themselves. So on the slide here, I have the Hebrew word tsara'at, which is most of the time in most English translations rendered as leprosy. Wrongly, but that's the way it's rendered, tsara'at. So the right side has the Greek word lepra. Now, lepra, as we're going to see momentarily, does not refer to leprosy. I know that they're very similar sounding, and that's where the English word came from. But the Greek word lepra, as we'll see momentarily, did not, in the first century, or for many centuries thereafter, did not refer to leprosy. All right, so I have a quote here on the screen from John Kleining. John Kleining is a Lutheran Old Testament scholar in Australia. This is from his Leviticus commentary where he's discussing tsara'at, the skin disease. And here's what he writes. The noun tsara'at is a general term for those kinds of infections that grow on the human skin or cloth. Now notice that's important, or cloth. So halot, that's the acronym for the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. It is kind of the official scholarly dictionary lexicon for Aramaic and biblical Hebrew. So that lexicon gives for it the broad definition of skin disease. It means something like scaliness, scabbiness, moldiness. While the King James Version translated it as leprosy, it is not the designation for what we now call leprosy or Hansen's disease. The Septuagint translated it by lepra, that's your Greek word, which means a scaly condition. So they translate it that way rather than elephantiasis, which is the Greek word for leprosy. So, all of this is to say that both the Hebrew word, the sara'at, and the Greek word, lepra, they refer just in general to some sort of skin disease or some kind of discoloration, because the Hebrew word could refer not just to something on the human body, but even to on houses or clothes. Well, leprosy doesn't grow on houses or clothes. So that's an inaccurate rendering of that Hebrew word. And every single scholar that I've read, conservative, liberal, wherever they are on the theological perspective, agrees that the sara'at in the Old Testament is not referring to Hansen's disease. It's not referring to today what we refer to as leprosy. Okay? And the same is going to hold true for the New Testament. So let's consult another work that I found extremely helpful on this subject. This is Jesus and the Forces of Death, the Gospel's Portrayal of Ritual Impurity in First Century Judaism. It's by Matthew Thiessen. And this is a summary of his section on this question. Literary evidence from India back in the 6th century BC describes leprosy, but archaeological and literary evidence from the Mediterranean suggests that disease first appeared in Egypt in the 3rd century BC, and then spread finally to the area around Israel and beyond it in the 1st century AD. So it didn't even make its appearance until the 1st century AD. Now, the Septuagint consistently translates to sara'at with lepra. We saw that already a minute ago. Scholars writing in Greek and Latin refer to leprosy not as lepra, but elephantiasis. Okay? That's their word for leprosy, Hansen's disease. Hippocrates, of course, the one connected with the Hippocratic Oath, Hippocrates, for example, uses the word lepra to describe symptoms that align with psoriasis or fungal infections. And then this quote from Matthew Thiessen. The first writer to use lepra to refer to leprosy was the doctor John of Damascus in the late 8th or early 9th century CE. Only as a result of John's mistaken conflation of leprosy with lepra did it become common for among later writers to interpret the lepra of the Gospels as leprosy. All of which is to say that when we see the word leprosy in the Scriptures, we have to do a mental translation and just think of it as some sort of skin disease or some kind of discoloration if it's on a house or piece of clothing. So even though I feel like we're kind of stuck with this, right? It's kind of one of those frustrating realities of history because we have so many translations for so many centuries now rendering this as leprosy that it's kind of hard even to talk about it without referring to these people as lepers who have leprosy. But at least be informed that when you hear that, in your own mind, make that switch and say, it's a skin disease. Now, it's a serious skin disease, and it's a skin disease that rendered people who had it as ritually impure, but it's not Hansen's disease. It's not what we call today leprosy. Okay, all that out of the way, let's see what Jesus says to these 10 men after they cry for mercy. So this is verse 14. When Jesus saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, they were cleansed. So first of all, why would Jesus tell them that? That's kind of a strange thing. Why didn't he just heal them right away, or like he did back in Luke chapter 5? Or why go to the priest? Well, this is when we need to. This is why we read the Gospels through Hebrew eyes, right? We have to go back to Leviticus. Leviticus chapter 13 and 14, 2 long chapters that deal with tissarat, with this skin disease or this discoloration of clothing or something on houses. That's where you have all of this Torah legislation with regard to how priests are to address the situation with people who have this skin disease. For instance, the very beginning of Luke 13 reads this way. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of tisara'at on the skin of his body, so this skin disease, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priest, and the priest shall examine the diseased area on the skin of the body. So basically, what the priest is doing is he's checking out this person who check out clothing or house or whatever has the signs of tisara'at, and the diagnosis is made. Maybe the the person needs to wait a little bit longer, or maybe now it's finally cleansed, and then they can go through this ritual process of offering a sacrifice and then being fully restored to the fellowship of the community. But for a while, they're outside. They're outside the camp, as it were. They have to live outside of the city. So that's a situation of these 10 men. Now, Jesus tells them, go show themselves to the priest. Now, this is interesting because earlier in Luke chapter 5, Jesus just heals a guy who has leprosy who falls down in front of him. He touches him and he heals him, and immediately his disease is taken care of. But in this case, that is not what happens. Jesus sends them away with this affliction still on them, which is indicative of the fact that they are trusting him, at least initially, to heal them of this problem. So they depart, and it's only as they went, they're on the way to presumably Jerusalem to see some priests, and while they're doing it, that is when they are cleansed. Okay? So they're on their way. They've left Jesus, and that's when they receive this cleansing. Now, let's see what happens when one of them, and only one of them, returns. This is verses 15 through 19. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, and by the way, the Greek there is different. Jesus says that we read earlier that they were cleansed. This is a different word for healed. Probably this is just used synonymously with cleansed. I'm thinking that this is just a further explanation of what it meant for them to be cleansed. The cleansing part is the language of Leviticus itself. So then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice, and he fell on his face at Jesus' feet. That's a typical posture, of course, of worship or of homage. It's the same thing that the leper did in Luke chapter 5. Fell down on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now, he was a Samaritan. This is the only place in the New Testament where someone offers thanks directly to Jesus. This is one of those real implicit moments where Luke is tapping us on the shoulder and pointing to the divinity of Jesus. Jesus is thanked because he is God in the flesh. So, giving him thanks, and then we have this added. This was delayed until in the narrative until now for dramatic effect. Now, he was a Samaritan. Jesus answered, "Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return to give praise to God except this foreigner?" And he said to him, "Rise and go your way. Your faith has sozo you," which is rendered here in the ESV as made you well. It's the Greek verb that can mean save, it can mean heal, it can mean a lot of different things. It can refer to spiritual salvation, like, brother, are you saved? Or it can refer to actually being delivered from something, maybe delivered from a disease or delivered from danger. Its Old Testament usage in the Septuagint typically refers to a kind of a physical rescue. All right, so what's happening here? Well, you got both things happening. The man is saved in the sense of he is now a believer in Jesus the Messiah, but he's also saved in the sense of being made well from this skin disease that he had. Now, this is a great chance for me because of what Jesus says here and the way that he says it, a great chance for me to point out something that I learned from Robert Alter, who's an Old Testament scholar. And right behind my head, you can see those 3 books there. That's his Hebrew Bible translation and commentary. I refer to them quite frequently. And I've got a quote here for you from what Robert Alter has observed about dialogue in the Bible. Now, he's talking about the Old Testament, but here it applies to the New Testament as well. So look at this slide, and I've basically just taken what Jesus said and broken it into 2 different segments. So Jesus begins by asking 3 questions, right? Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? Now, there is no response, right? Nobody else, the Samaritan, nobody else said anything to Jesus. So there's sort of a gap there. Then, instead of us reading that Jesus went on to say, "Rise and go your way, your faith has made you well," the biblical narrator has inserted, "and he said to him." And then we have the quotation again. So here's Robert Alter's observation. When the first party speaks and the second party does not respond, so the first party here would be Jesus, the second party would be the Samaritan. So when the first party speaks and there is no response, And a second speech of the first party is introduced. So that's the he said to him. There is an intimation of some sort of failure of response. Basically saying, and I've once I realized this, once Robert Alter pointed this out to me, I see it all over the Old Testament. Very frequently, you'll have someone say something, or they'll ask a question, and then we'll read, and he also said, or he went on to say, meaning there was no response on the part of the person that is addressed. Same thing's happening here. No one says anything back to Jesus, and so the narrator, in this case Luke, says, and he said to him. So he picked up the discourse again and responded this way. Now, point out one thing about Jesus' use of the word for foreigner. So on your screen, you're looking at what's sometimes called the temple warning inscription. I think 2 copies of these have been found. These were actually at the temple in Jerusalem. They were placed at a certain border, a balustrade, where from that point on, if you were a Gentile, you could not go beyond that point. So of course, it's all in Greek. And here's one translation of it. No foreigner shall enter within the forecourt and the balustrade around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his subsequent death. So the blood's on your hands, buddy, if you go past this sign. Now, I have underlined and read the word allogenes, which Jesus uses here in talking about the Samaritan. So isn't that interesting? Same word that Jesus uses to describe the Samaritan is the same word that is used to describe a foreigner, a non-Jew who can't go any farther than that border within the temple. And if he does or she does, well, then they have themselves to blame for their subsequent death. Now, the reason I find this very fascinating is because this Samaritan, a foreigner, allogenes, could not go he could enter the temple courts, like the far court, the court of the Gentiles. But if he went beyond that other point, he'd be killed. But what's he doing here? This foreigner is coming up to Jesus, placing himself in a posture of worship right before who? God. God in the flesh, the one whose body is the temple, the Word that became flesh and tabernacled among us. There's no barrier, in other words. That border that I mentioned earlier has been eradicated. Here, a foreigner, a Samaritan, comes to the walking, talking, living, breathing, Holy of Holies, Jesus himself. So you see, the ministry of Jesus is undoing the borders. It's breaking down the barriers, and he's drawing people to himself. He's drawing the Samaritan to himself. He's going to draw other Gentiles to himself. Of course, he's drawing the people of Judea to himself as well. He's breaking down that barrier between Jew and Gentile, he who is the temple in the flesh, and bringing people to himself. Now, one more thing. In the story from the Old Testament about Naaman, the Syrian, who also had skin disease, if we look at that story from 2 Kings and compare it to what's happening here in Luke chapter 17, there are some fascinating parallels between these two. So sorry it's so grainy, I just took this with my phone, but this is from a handbook on the historical books by Victor Hamilton, who provides us with this little parallel graph. So you've got the story of Naaman from 2 Kings 5, and then, of course, the story of the 10 lepers from Luke 17. And notice the parallels. So Naaman visits Elisha in Samaria. He's the one with the tesara'at, the skin disease. Well, this miracle in Luke 17 takes place between Samaria and Galilee. Secondly, there's no cure in the presence of the healer. Naaman has to go to the Jordan. Same thing here. There's no cure in the presence of the healer. Remember, when they leave, they still have the skin disease. They have to go. And it's only after they've gone and there's some distance between them and Jesus that they're healed. Thirdly, Naaman, a Syrian, returns to thank Elisha, and one leper, a Samaritan, returns to thank Jesus. Naaman praises God. He says, now I know there's no God except in Israel. Same thing, a similar thing here with the Samaritan. He turned back and praised God with a loud voice. And then finally, Elisha says to Naaman, go in peace. And then Jesus said to the Samaritan, get up and go on your way. And I like to think that when Jesus told the Samaritan to get up and go on his way, the way that he's talking about is with Jesus on his way to Jerusalem. This man became a disciple. What about the other 9? Well, who knows? They certainly believed at first. I like the seed that fell on the shallow soil. They believed for a time and then didn't. Who knows? The accent is on the fact that this Samaritan is a true disciple. He believed the word of Jesus, he acted on the word of Jesus, and when he was healed, he came back to Jesus. He fell on his face. He worshiped this Son of God, this temple, this tabernacle. Here was the Holy of Holies, where this Samaritan was right there in the presence of God himself, giving him thanks, receiving from him the word of salvation. Your faith has sozo you, has saved you, rescued you, healed you, made you well. So the Samaritan becomes, for all of us, the model of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, to live by his word, to receive his gifts, to praise his name, to worship before him, to receive into our ears and into our hearts the saving and healing word of God himself in Jesus Christ. So that is a trip through that particular story. I hope all of this has been helpful to you. And if it has, please share it with your friends. And I look forward to continuing next week with what our Lord has in store for us then. Hope that you're all doing well. God's grace, mercy, and peace be yours in abundance. Thanks.